Good afternoon. My name is Allison Kaplan. I'm Director of Education here at the National First Ladies Library at the National First Ladies Historic Site in Canton, Ohio. I want to thank everyone who's joined us today, whether you're watching through Zoom as we're filming, or you're broadcasting this on Facebook, or you're watching on YouTube after the fact. We want to thank you for being here. If you have questions for us today, if you have questions about the film, you can leave it in the chat or put it on the Facebook chat, and we will be sure to share those questions with our speaker this afternoon. And we are happy to engage anyone who wants to engage in the discussion with us. And I've left our slides rolling this afternoon, because I want to tell you a few of our upcoming programs. So we do our film screening as a virtual program in conjunction with Stark Library. So as far as the films go, we curate a film that is centered on women's history every single month, and you can screen that by registering or connecting with Stark Library if you're in Ohio or Canton with your Stark Library card, and then join us for a discussion. So for this month, we're going to be talking about the film She's Beautiful When She's Angry. But next month, we're going to be delving a little deeper into the history of the second wave of the women's movement and looking at the film Equal Means Equal, about the Equal Rights Amendment. And we will be joined by Tracy Thomas, also of the University of Akron, at the University of Akron Law School. So I'm super excited about that program. I think it should be really great. The second thing I want to mention is you can see the National First Ladies Historic Site scrolling. We have 3 new exhibitions, and they're all really amazing. So if you are interested in First Ladies, we have a new exhibition on the first 100 days of a First Lady's time in office. That's everything from planning the Easter egg rolls to the inauguration. So there's a lot of fashion, some of those social issues that First Ladies were interested in, from more contemporary First Ladies and Be Best to Lady Bird Johnson's beautification program. There's all sorts of interesting objects that represent many, many First Ladies on view. It is definitely worth seeing. So if you are local to us, please come on down to see that. We also have an exhibition that is celebrating the 150th anniversary of the McKinleys as a couple. So I think that should be really amazing. And last but not least, we have Anne Lowe. So the lower level of the First Ladies Historic Site features these amazing mini gowns by Anne Lowe, who was the African-American woman who designed Jacqueline Kennedy's wedding dress. And we have all of these amazing mini dresses that she designed as well. This is the first time that we've actually explain the whole story and biography of Anne Lowe. There are perfume bottles, there's sewing machine, there's all sorts of information. You get to play the historian and analyze different dresses and figure out if they're Anne Lowe dresses. So it's a very small but mighty exhibition and very cool. So we are very excited and proud of that. As far as lectures and upcoming discussions, next month for our legacy lecture, we will have Annette Dunlap. She is an amazing historian who has written about Lou Hoover, as well as Frances Cleveland. So we're going to be talking about Frances Cleveland and her time as First Lady and her first 100 days in office. So you can register for any of our programs on Eventbrite, and you can also pull up past programs on our YouTube. So there's a few scrolling there related to fashion. If that's something that you're interested, you can check that out. And then as far as our discussions go, we also have a book club discussion that meets quarterly. It is a really fun group. We meet in Zoom meetings, so you will get a chance to have your say and be on the screen if you want, but if you just want to hang out, you are welcome to do that as well. And we're reading the novel White Houses. It's about Lorena Hickok and Eleanor Roosevelt. It's really interesting. I just finished it and I am having a really good time trying to figure out what is fact and what is fiction in that book. And in order to figure it out, one of the things we're going to do in the fall is read the great new biography of Eleanor. So this is kind of a two-part fact versus fiction look at Eleanor. So if you're a big fan of Eleanor or you just love to read, come on over to National First Ladies Library and join us for the virtual discussion. I am going to stop my screen share of this, and I am going to introduce the film. The audio should be on, and hopefully you can hear me. What I am going to do is introduce the film by showing you a preview. Again, with our film discussions, there aren't really any spoilers. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, we're not going to tell you anything that's going to shock you or keep you from enjoying the film. So I will share my screen. We will take a look at the preview, and then I'll introduce our visitor today. So give me 1 second. Let's see, go over here. Safari. Hopefully you can see this.
We should have the right to choose. We should be mad. Are you mad?
Susan Fluke. She's having so much sex she can't afford the contraception. Says that she must be paid to have sex.
Planned Parenthood, gonna get rid of that.
It makes her a slut, right?
If it's a legitimate rape, the female body has ways to try to shut that whole thing down.
What you see here is the beginning of a movement that women are human beings and that we have equal rights.
We can now teach women how to fight discrimination against their own companies.
There were groups in New York, Ann Arbor, Madison, in Boston.
You're talking about liberation and freedom on the racial side, and then all of a sudden men are going to turn around and start talking about putting you in your place.
There was a group called Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, which
this was one of my favorites. How did women unite? We certainly did, didn't we?
The women have a fundamental right to control their own bodies and to control their own lives.
The bitter lesson is that no victories are permanent.
People are raped regardless of what they wear.
You're not allowed to retire from women's issues.
This is what a feminist looks like. This is what a feminist looks like. This is what a feminist looks like. This is what a feminist looks like.
So that gives you a little taste of what the documentary is about. And now I want to introduce our speaker for the day. Dr. Cara Cavarin is a native of southeastern Michigan. In 2004, she received her bachelor's degree in history from Eastern Michigan University. She continued her studies in American history and feminist theory at Purdue University and was awarded her master's degree in 2006 and her doctorate in 2011. Dr. Cavarin's research interests lay at the intersection of modern American popular culture and gender. Her dissertation, which she is currently still revising into a manuscript that I can't wait to read, is titled Gendered Underground: Men, Women, and American Punk Rock from 1965 to 1995. She's also written on homosexuality and comic books and is currently working on a socio-economic analysis of slasher films. She lives in Akron, where she teaches women's studies at the University of Akron. Thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this film.
So The beginning of the film introduces viewers to some of the pivotal events that brought the women's movement to the forefront, like the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, to seminal works like the Feminist mystique. They define a mainstream movement powered by organizations like NOW, as well as the more radical groups that help push the movement in new directions, like the one that was mentioned in the preview, W.I.T.C.H, and a few others. Can you speak about the influence on these different underground groups and how they influence the feminist movement?
Yeah. I would say, like, some of the organizations I would not consider to be underground necessarily. I mean, so, like, some of the ones covered in the film obviously were, like, when they're talking about things like the Jane Network and like things that were intentionally kept hidden. But part of what those organizations were trying to do was bring this stuff to the surface. Is to bring attention to it and to say, like, hey, these issues are important and they're some of the most ignored. I feel like for a lot of those women, like you mentioned, we're coming out of what we call the new left, right? So during the 60s, there's all these organizations, like you mentioned, the anti-war movement. There's like the Students for a Democratic Society. There's the free speech movement. There's obviously like the civil rights movement. And historians tend to group all of those organizations together and call them the New Left. And I think that for women who were very active in those New Left organizations, were becoming increasingly disillusioned at the fact that none of these men who were supposed to be working towards equality and liberation had any interest in equality for women. Like, it was very clear that if you went and worked with, say, the SNCC, which was one of the younger arms of the civil rights movement that was mostly like college students and was considered the more radical movement. So it was Students for a Democratic, was SNCC. I always forget what the acronym stands for. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
Mm-hmm. You got it.
You know, they had this house that was their headquarters that was called the Freedom House. And like, for the women and men who were working in the Freedom House, there were very different jobs available depending on your gender. And for a lot of women who were looking at that, they were going, how does this look any different than being a housewife in the suburbs? I'm expected to make the food and make the coffee and clean the house and take the notes at the meetings and write up other people's ideas. And I don't get any opportunities for leadership positions. Nobody cares what I think about things. I'm not allowed to make policy decisions. And how is that any different than the role that women have historically always been expected to take, tying us to domesticity and submissiveness and these ideas that by the time, you know, it's the 60s, they're frustratingly outdated for these younger women. And so there was a really famous incident where Stokely Carmichael, who was then president of SNCC, said that the only position for women within SNCC was prone, meaning like laying on your back. And for women, both Black and white, who had put years and effort and put their bodies on the line, you know, to try to deal with these racial issues, like that was just incredibly dehumanizing and demeaning and upsetting from people who were saying they were working for equality. It's like, whose equality are you fighting for here? Because it's very clearly not women and not Black women. Mm-hmm. And so when, you know, they were running voting rights campaigns in the South and their slogan was one man, one vote, like, there was a lot of Black women who were like, really? Like, that's the slogan you're going for? And so you had these women who were incredibly frustrated from working within these organizations who were looking for ways to bring these issues to light and to say, like, we can't just keep ignoring these aspects of inequality because they're so deeply embedded in our society that the people who are benefiting from them, meaning men, don't want to even touch that because that would then be about acknowledging and toppling their privilege. And like the most of the men involved, like hashtag not all men or whatever, were not interested in having those conversations. And so for the younger women, the women who were becoming the more radical, like you mentioned W.I.T.C.H, and I would add the red stockings to that in terms of like the younger, like radical women's organizations. They were all about drawing attention to these issues. For organizations like Now, which were tended to be made up of older women who were not coming from the New Left, who were coming from, like a lot of them had been veterans of World War II and that generation, and they had, you know, gone to work during the war because they were asked to, and then after the war they were told, like, great job ladies, now go back to the kitchen, like with your college degree and your 5 years of factory experience, like you're not wanted in the workforce anymore. And so after, like for women like Betty Friedan, after having done that and, you know, like being a journalist, she moved to the suburbs and had 2 kids and was like, this sucks. Like, I'm not into this. This is supposed to be, you know, when we talk about the American dream tends to look very different depending on whether or not you're a man or a woman. So the American dream for men, particularly in the post-war years, was like a good job and, you know, a middle management position and a college education on the VI Bill and owning a home and owning a car and getting married and having kids, but not having to actually raise your kids. And for women, the American dream was living in a house in the suburbs, incredibly isolated and only talking to toddlers all day. And like, it turns out that for a lot of women, that wasn't particularly satisfying. And for women who had had this experience, who had either worked during the war or had a college degree, they started to feel more and more like they were not living up to their potential and not having opportunities to live the kind of lives that they wanted to live. And that there was a generation of women who were told, like, if you want to be a lawyer, you marry a lawyer because that's as close as you're going to get. And it turns out that, like, after doing that, and this is what Betty Friedan is talking about in The Feminine Mystique, that like, it's not like, and then you feel unhappy and then you feel guilty for feeling unhappy because you've been told your entire life that as a woman, having kids and a husband is supposed to be enough for you. That's supposed to be the best that you can hope for. And so if you have that and then you feel unhappy, you start to feel like there's something wrong with you because there can't be something wrong with the American dream. And so there were these women who basically had the most privilege that it was possible to have in American society as a woman, who were, you know, wealthy and had husbands who could pay the bills and a nice house in the suburbs and a picket fence and a better dog and 2.5 kids, or like whatever it's the 60s, so it's like 4 kids, but that was supposed to be it for them. And they were like, well, I'm not happy by this, so let's talk to each other and then maybe do something about it. And so you have these 2 very different groups of women, like the older, like liberal feminist women who tended to be more, I don't want to say respectable, but like it is kind of like more established. They were older. A lot of them already had families, they had professional degrees, and they tended to approach things from like a very liberal perspective of like, we need to change laws, we need to deal with getting women into college and, you know, shooting down some of the particularly egregious like employment discrimination issues. And then you had the younger women, like the W.I.T.C.H and the Red Stockings and the New Left women who were like, we need to be radical about this and just change the way people think about women. And so you have these two very contrasting kind of ideas about how to deal with gender inequality, that like these women are not always going to get along with each other.
Yeah, it reminded me so much because at National First Ladies Library, we're thinking about first ladies, and the first ladies that were involved in the women's movement and the ERA, like Rosalind Carter and Betty Ford, were definitely those more conservative women who had soft power. So it was fascinating for me that this film took a look at both of those types of women, and this idea that like the feminist movement is more than just one type of women. There's a lot of different factions and groups and a lot of ideas at play, and that the film was sometimes critical of those groups and ideas. But the most radical thing from the beginning was that some of these women were getting together and just talking and having conversations that they hadn't had before, and that was so radical that the FBI was involved undercover or planting women to attend these discussions, and they're just talking talking about stuff.
And actually they have a point. I mean, I think that and to me that's one of the things that's so interesting, because you know, when I'm talking about liberal feminism and radical feminism, like those labels have actual definitions attached to them that is not necessarily how I feel like the phrase radical has come to mean angry or militant, like, and in reality, when we're talking about feminism, radical feminism is the idea that we need to change traditions and change minds and change the way people think about women rather than changing laws. For radical feminist perspectives, they're like, what does a law do for us? Because we've had equal pay on the books since 1964. And even today, women are still making 80 cents to every dollar a man makes. So what good is a law if nobody follows it? So we need to change the way our culture thinks about women and treats women. And so radical feminism, rather than being, you know, about being militant or being angry or, you know, shouting at people, which I feel like is how radical, like the phrase radical has been kind of co-opted maybe. For them, radical feminism was like, let's just change the way we think. And if you want to change the way a group of people think, you have to start small. And so these, what at the time in the 70s were called consciousness raising groups. And so I think that that's one of the best examples of radical feminism that exists, because it was about just talking to women and asking them like, so what does it mean to be a woman in America? And it really sort of brought in what becomes one of the slogans of the second wave of feminism, which is the personal is political. And the idea behind these consciousness raising groups was to get very small groups of hopefully diverse women together. And again, like there was no overarching organization here. There was no like consciousness raising group headquarters where you had to like apply to start a consciousness raising group. Like a lot of these groups met in community centers and public libraries. Libraries are always big. And there was a group in, I think it was Baltimore, who actually released their own guidelines. And they were like, this is what works for us. And if you want to set up a group, like, here's how we suggest you do it, but also do whatever works for your community. Like, you don't have to follow these, like, this is just like us letting you know what worked for us. And it was stuff like they, you know, keep the group small. Like, you don't want to have a leader. You don't want to, you know, you want to make sure that everybody can talk. You want to, like, some of the rules were really, or guidelines were really interesting, that it was like, you were only allowed to talk about your personal experiences. No story about your friend's cousin or like something else that happened to someone. You weren't allowed to give advice to each other. You were just supposed to listen and support and discuss together these issues. And I think for a lot of the women who participated in this, their main takeaway was that these incidents of sexism, sexual harassment, assault, unsupportive men in their lives, issues with childcare, all of these things that they felt like were individual problems that women had to navigate throughout their lives were actually problems that every woman they know had faced. And so this goes back to this personal as political idea, this idea that what seems to be a personal problem is actually a larger political problem, and political problems have political solutions. And so the idea was that you can't personally navigate yourself out of an oppressive, sexist society. You need to get together and work together to tackle these systemic issues. Otherwise, nothing's ever going to change. And so for a lot of women, the consciousness raising groups were like the first step of looking at how sexism and these institutions and structures had actually impacted their personal lives, and then sort of expanding out from there and saying like, okay, so how do we tackle this within our communities? How do we tackle this within our states? How do we tackle this within our country? Like once you realize that something that you have to deal with on a daily basis that is terrible and sucks is something that every other woman has a similar story about, then I think you get to the next step of like, how do we start to mitigate some of this harm? How do we start to fix these problems? And so I love a consciousness raising group. It's one of the things that I have to give a shout out to my 90s riot girls, because consciousness raising groups were brought back in the 90s with the riot girl groups. And I think that there's a very obvious like direct link between what the riot girls were doing in the 90s and what the consciousness raising groups were doing in the 70s.
I wonder if you can, I know one of the things that I really enjoyed about that film was the way that it talked about race, the way that it talked about issues of sexuality, and that the feminist movement wasn't always inclusive. And I bring that up because as we're talking about consciousness raising, your guidelines, I want them to be like social media guidelines for people to use today as a side note.
Yeah.
But in the 90s, the riot girl movement had the same issues. So this seems like an ongoing thing. Can you talk about issues of race and sexual identity in the 1970s and what happened, how people dealt with them, how they might have been ignored or overlooked?
Yeah. I think historically speaking, the feminist movement has always been overwhelmingly white and upper class. And in part that was, and I was thinking about this last night when I was looking over your questions, is I was like, why is the feminist movement so white and upper middle class historically? And then I started thinking about, well, a lot of it has to do with who can afford to be an activist. Mm-hmm. And, you know, for a lot of the men who were active in those younger, like new left organizations, in all honesty, they often had wives and girlfriends who were supporting them, like who were taking care of their kids and taking care of their homes and often worked to support their husbands and boyfriends' political activities. But women rarely got that kind of support from male partners. And so for a lot of the women who were activists, they were being supported by their parents. And so who has parents that can afford to take care of an adult child who chooses to be an unpaid political activist instead of either getting married because you're a woman or getting a job? And the answer to that is upper class white women. And so if you go back to, say, the suffrage movement, you're going to see it mostly be run by upper class white women. And you're going to see this again in the 60s. And with the 90s, you know, they were trying to address it with intersectionality, but it was still very much like college women. And if you just look at who can afford in this country to go to college, you know, I mean, I can tell you that I teach at the University of Akron. Akron is what, 40 to 50% Black. The university is 12 to 15% Black. Like that, unfortunately, college has not been accessible to everyone. And I think that the movie does a really good job pointing out the issues of racism within the feminist movement. And I think that since they interviewed a lot of women, just about every woman they interview in the movie is white, aren't they?
I think all but like one or two.
Yeah. Which, and for Black women in particular, you know, in the 60s and 70s, they were really placed in a double bind sort of position where you had the sexist civil rights movement or the racist feminist movement. And like, now pick where you're gonna work. You can either be devalued because you're a woman by the civil rights movement and made to like clean the house and type up the notes, or you can go work with the white feminists who are gonna devalue you because you're a Black woman and think that you should be, you know, submissive and subservient to them because of their whiteness. And so for a lot of Black women, they were like, where's the third option? And the third option was creating your own movements and organizations, which a lot of them did. And so you saw, I can't remember if the film talked about the Combahee River Collective or not, but there were some groups of Black women who were just like, we just need to go forge our own path. We need to start our own organizations, and we need to address, you know, what it means particularly to be a Black woman in our society, because this isn't just about stacking forms of oppression on top of each other. This is about actually critiquing and analyzing what it means to be a Black woman. And so the Combahee River Collective, who also, they were queer women as well. And so they were queer, Black, most of them were poor women. And they would argue that everyone should be working to end their oppression, because ending the oppression of queer, poor Black women means ending everyone's oppression. Because for them to be free, you have to dismantle all of these different systems of oppression, and then everyone would be free. So they were like, everyone should be working for the equality of queer Black women. And I think that's genius. Like, I think that's a great idea. And I think that we should all be doing that. And so, you know, and that's not even getting into the homophobia and the Lavender Menace stuff, and the idea that, you know, for a lot of these women, they wanted to distance themselves from lesbians, and that has historically been one of the ways that the feminist movement was like disregarded, or, you know, basically you call a woman a lesbian and you're basically saying, I don't have to listen to you. You're just a lesbian. And so those women, rather than saying like, well, why is calling someone a lesbian invalidating them? Like, let's talk about how this links back to patriarchy and the idea that the only women we should listen to are women who exist within this system where we are subservient to men. Instead, a lot of the feminists were like, yeah, let's just kick those lesbians out of here so that nobody calls us a lesbian. Which of course was a terrible thing to do and incredibly homophobic and short-sighted. But I mean, they were a product of their time, and making, you know, not every decision that was made was a good decision. And so then you had, you know, women who identified as lesbians who were like, okay, well, we need to start our own organization as well. And so I think that was one, I sort of go back and forth on this, of thinking like the fractionalization of the feminist movement is one of the things that made it easier to defeat, because when you have all women together fighting for something, we're a huge force. But when women start to splinter off into these individual groups, they lose some of that force. But at the same time, you shouldn't have to work with people who don't respect you and respect who you are. And so the feminist movement has historically been racist. Like, that is just a reality. The feminist movement has also historically been homophobic. That is a reality. Don't even get me started on their transphobia and issues that we're still fighting with today. And so we have to be, I think, honest and sort of unflinching when looking at our own history and seeing how we can improve. And again, I feel like that's some of the things that the Riot Girls were trying to do with the third wave of feminism, and really bringing in these issues of intersectionality and saying we need to reach out, and we need, you know, we need to tackle racism, and we need to tackle immigration, and we need to tackle disability rights, because women are a part of every group. And that's one of the things that makes it so hard for us to organize, is because we're so diverse. And it's really hard to bring in any specific issues when we cover the gamut of every lived experience in America. And again, I think that it's tough stuff to grapple with, because we all have our own biases and issues that we might even ourselves be unaware of, because we live in a white supremacist society. And if you're a white person in America, you've been drinking the Kool-Aid your whole life, it's really hard to deprogram yourself in an instant or a decade. But, you know, and so it leads to, in the 60s and 70s, this fracturing of the movement, which again is one of the things that I think makes it easier to defeat in the end. But I also feel like the fracturing was inevitable, because, you know, when you don't respect all women and you're not fighting for all women, those women have no reason to fight for you either. And so we just end up with this situation. I feel like I started talking for a really long time.
That was great.
Your question.
That was really helpful. And I think you addressed some of the issues related to being Black or being queer within the feminist movement that the film was critical of. And I think you made a great point that there weren't a lot of Black women represented in the film. So one of the other things I wanted to discuss was the way that some of these groups use the media. They really did a great job of manipulating the media. And when I think about the feminist movement, or some of us think of the 70s and the feminist movement, a lot of people talk about bra burning. But one of the things I did not know until I watched this film was that there were academic women who had gone through the system, earned PhDs, studied history from a male-centric viewpoint, or whatever their field was. They burned their degrees.
I know. When I saw that, I literally gasped. I was like,
no! It was shocking to me. And it was a story that I did not know. So I wanted to two questions for you. Can you talk about the media and the way that they manipulated the media? But I also think that that really speaks to women's studies. And you are a women's studies professor. The development and establishment of women's studies at these universities over the past like 50 years or so, and how that happened, because obviously there is a huge disconnect. And as someone who, you know, the first class I took in college was women's studies, I was so psyched to sit down and pumped to learn, but that didn't exist, and that there were these women in academia who had like no experience of studying people who look like them. Can you speak to that?
Well, let me start with your first question, which is how they use the media. And I would say that, you know, these women were not reinventing the wheel. They were taking what they had seen work for other activist organizations and then applying that to gender oppression. So the bra burning thing, which was actually started out as a myth that comes from that Miss America pageant protest that the film shows very nicely. They had a trash can, which they named the Freedom Trash Can, which I feel like is reminiscent of the SNCC Freedom House. And the idea that they had was that women would come and bring what they considered to be the examples of oppression. And so some women did bring bras, specifically those long line bras, which were like the cone looking bras, you know, when you see films from the 60s and you're like, wow, those are like very pointy, like those sorts of like very structured bras. Things like makeup and high heels. One woman actually brought her son's Playboy magazines, which I can imagine that son was like not happy about that. the idea that they had was that they would throw all of this stuff in the trash can and then light the trash can on fire. And this was something that they had taken from the anti-draft movement, where, you know, young men were showing up at courthouses and burning their draft cards. And so they were like, you know, this is a way to show our disgust, to show a rejection of these ideas. But they couldn't get a permit to start a fire on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And so they just like angry threw stuff away instead of lighting stuff on fire that first time. I'm sure people did burn bras later, but that Miss America pageant protest, they told people they would only talk to female reporters. There were 0 female reporters in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1968. So they did not talk to the press, which meant that the press was like, well, fine, you're not going to talk to us. We're just going to write whatever we want. And that's where you get the myth of bra burning. And I think that after that, the media, which is run by men, I mean, we just have to be very honest about what the late 1960s media landscape looked like, right? There's no internet, there's no, you know, cable TV, there's no 24-hour news stations, there's 3 channels and the newspaper, and that's where you get your news from. And so these women staging these protests, which were intended to garner attention, didn't then have a say about whether or not that attention was positive or negative. And so a lot of press, a lot of editors and reporters who were all men intentionally went out and interviewed women who were against the feminist movement. That they didn't really have an interest in talking to the feminists themselves. They just wanted to find women on the street who would denounce it. As a bunch of women complaining about stuff, or like women overreacting, you know how we're all over emotional, like that sort of thing. And so you get this very negative press reaction to the feminist movement. And so for feminists, they're like, well, we want to get our ideas out there. So how do we do that if the mainstream media is ignoring us or making us look bad intentionally? And the answer to that was, well, we just need to do it ourselves. We need to, you know, write our own pamphlets. We need to write our own newspapers. We need to start a magazine. And we get Ms. Magazine in 1972, right? Which becomes the sort of publication arm of the second wave of the feminist movement, where they're like, we're going to talk about everything from equal pay to body hair to, you know, like if you're curious about what feminists were actually saying, then the first couple of years of Ms. Magazine is where you go to look for that, because you couldn't get even factually accurate media representations about the feminist movement at the time. And so, you know, this was another thing where feminists looked at this situation and said, okay, we have to do it ourselves. If nobody else is going to let us talk, we're going to write ourselves, we're going to publish ourselves, we're going to send out pamphlets and mimeograph. I mean, there's no copy machines yet. So it's like mimeographed stuff. Like it was a big undertaking, but they did it. And so that was the media representation part of your question. Now remind me what the second part of your question was.
We were talking about the women burning their degrees, and I was
right.
A history of women's studies.
Oh, that burning the degree thing just makes my heart clench because, the Women's Studies Department at the University of Akron is actually one of the earliest in Ohio. It was started in 1986. And it's really in the 70s and 80s that you start to get women's studies departments. And I think that you're exactly right. Like this was an attempt, and it still is today, to address a hole, a big gender-shaped hole that exists in a lot of people's educations. Now, I still have students come through my class who know nothing about the suffrage movement, who know nothing about really American history at all, which as a historian is very upsetting to me. But that, you know, students are always sort of horrified that they didn't know these things before, that not only didn't they know how the birth control pill, for example, was was created or when it was invented or when it was available to people, but they don't even really know how it works. Like that to them, it's just this magic pill you take and then you don't get pregnant, like, which I guess is kind of true, but also is not the whole story. And so I'm still talking to students today who just didn't get any of this information in any other place. And so I always tell my students that women's studies shouldn't exist, that I would like to get to a point where women's studies doesn't need to exist, because everything that I teach my students should be taught to them in other classes. They should be getting it from their sociology classes and their anthropology classes and their media studies classes and their psychology classes and their history classes. Women's studies has to exist because they're not getting it anywhere else. And as true as that was in the 70s and 80s when these departments were first being established, I think it's distressingly still true today. So yeah.
Well, thank you to speaking to that. And again, I don't know why, like the burning of the degree, I know it's just a piece of paper, but it was like more, it was so shocking. And I feel
like, because for those of us who have, I feel like for anyone who has a degree, that represents years of hard work and sacrifice and thousands of dollars, that like to see someone burn that in protest, it like, I'm like, I consider myself a radical feminist. I couldn't do it. I would look at my PhD and think about how I spent 11 years living in Indiana to get that thing, and I just wouldn't be able to do it. So kudos to them, but also that's horrifying.
So you brought up the birth control pill. One of the things that the film delves into is the history of Our Bodies, Ourselves that became a seminal women's healthcare book. And I remember pre-internet or early internet, that was the place to go for any information on birth control, reproduction. It's still, I remember my mom's copy of it sitting on the shelf and having access to that as a teenager and thinking like, wow, like this is mind-blowing, or finding it at the library. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And what maybe within we've talked a little bit about like zines or magazines, and the film really, besides the consciousness raising groups and the meetings, those sorts of publications, whether they were pamphlets or they became major books that traveled the world, like what happened around that? Because you have a lot of knowledge about magazines and underground documents and zines. I just want to hear more about that.
So Our Bodies, Ourselves actually did start as a pamphlet. It came from the Boston Women's Health Collective. And I think they do a great job talking about like why it was created in the film. But again, like it was just sort of the idea that, you know, if you can imagine for the people watching this, like what your sex education was like, and then imagine you were going through sex education in the 1960s, which just didn't exist. And it wasn't just about, I think that one of the benefits of Our Bodies, Ourselves is that it looks at a woman's whole lifespan, let's say, and that, you know, it's not just about here's how your anatomy works, here's how conception works, here's how birth control works, but it's also like, they cover abortion, they cover pregnancy, they cover postpartum depression, they cover menopause, like things that adult women, you know, just didn't have information about. If you were lucky, you had a mother or an older woman in your life who could talk you through these things, but a lot of that stuff ended up, you know, folky type family remedies, like, oh, you're carrying high, that's a girl, like that sort of myths, as opposed to actual like scientific facts. And so, you know, women again looked at this situation and they were like, you know, this sucks for us. What can we do about it? And so they put together this book themselves. The women wrote it themselves. It included, you know, personal anecdotes. I actually have only ever read the first version of it. So I don't know what version you had in your house. They redo it. I think they're on like maybe 11th edition now that came out about 10 years ago. I feel like they update it about every 10 years or so. As a historian, I've only ever looked at like the original one. So I don't know what new information it includes these days.
It's a lot bigger. I remember the one in the 90s, like my mom had the original one, which is like that. And
yeah,
it's like really thick. And I thought
there's a lot to talk about
in the film, that it's translated to other languages, that they kind of let go of this material and pass it along to women around the world, and then they edit it as they see fit and publish it.
Yeah, it's not, I mean, they didn't copyright it. They were like, here, like, reproduce this. I mean, this was a real grassroots attempt to disseminate knowledge that they felt like was important to women's lives. And so it didn't just deal with the biology of reproduction and how we sort of think about sex education. It talked about healthy relationship models. It talks about, you know, sexuality and masturbation and things that were just considered very taboo topics, both at the time and still. Our sex education sucks today. Like, I end up giving my college students a lot of sex education because they just don't know anything, because Ohio has very few state mandated sex education policies, and they were taking a lot of money of the federal abstinence only sex education grants that existed for the last few decades. And Ohio took that money, which meant they were teaching either abstinence or at best abstinence plus sex education. If you go to a private school, you don't have to get any sex education at all. And so we're still raising kids who have no idea how their own bodies work. And so for something like Our Bodies, Ourselves, you know, that was really important. And I also would just say that, because I feel like we might be running out of time. But one of the other questions that you asked me was about the 1971 Child Care Act.
Yeah, that was fascinating. And I wanted you to talk about that because one of the things that the woman said who was speaking to it was like, we forget our history.
Yeah.
And nobody knows that this happened. So that there was a Child Care Act that passed in 1971. And just making like ties to past, present, like thinking about this pandemic and what women as parents have been through is amazing, that there's still no federally mandated childcare. And in 1971, Nixon vetoed it, and nobody remembers that.
He vetoed it because he basically, his excuse for that would be tantamount to communism, because women would be giving their children to the state to raise for them. And I feel like there's a link between the passage of that, the failure of that, Our Bodies, Ourselves, and us not knowing our history. And that is that it all ties back in, from my perspective, to abortion. And the fact that when we talk about reproductive justice in our society, we almost exclusively talk about abortion. And I feel like this has been one of the ways that anti-abortion activists, who also tend to be very traditional about what women's roles should be and invested in controlling women's bodies and women's lives, the fact that they have made this one topic of abortion the central issue of all reproductive justice means that other forms of reproductive justice have gotten ignored, overlooked, or just forgotten about. So when we talk about reproductive justice, we're not just talking about abortion. We're talking about sex education, having safe, reliable birth control technologies. We're talking about maternity leave, breastfeeding accommodations. We're talking about regulated and subsidized childcare policies. Like all of that, reproductive justice is not just about making decisions about whether or not you're going to carry a fetus to term. It's about everything that goes into reproduction. And so when we focus, and this is, you know, I think to the benefit of people who don't want maternity leave, who don't want breastfeeding accommodations, who don't want to federally regulate or subsidize childcare, you know, they have gotten everybody so worked up and so focused on the issue of abortion that all of this other stuff, we don't have maternity leave in this country. Mm-hmm. Like that tends to get ignored and pushed to the side because we're all so focused on the political hot potato that abortion has become. And so to me, I relate like, oh, we don't know anything about the Child Care Act because it failed, you know, years ago, and nobody talks about it anymore. And nobody talks about subsidizing or regulating childcare anymore. Like nobody talks about federal maternity leave anymore. Like nobody talks about those things because we're also focused on this one aspect, which is the most controversial and contentious aspect of reproductive justice. And so all the rest of this stuff just gets hand waved away as if it doesn't really matter.
I want to ask, there's a follow-up question in the chat. And I love to tie things to first ladies. So Betty Ford is my OG who spoke out. I'm thinking about women in soft power. She spoke about abortion, that she was pro-choice, and she also rallied for the Equal Rights Amendment. So there's a question here about the Equal Rights Amendment that I wanted to address. What will it take to finally get it passed? But I also want to, as we're thinking about history and we're talking about women's history, we just celebrated during the pandemic the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women's suffrage. And in the film, they were protesting and building their protests around the 50th anniversary. Which means that we're at the 50th anniversary of the second wave of feminism. I wondered, like, historically, like, what does that mean? I haven't seen anyone commemorating that necessarily, and maybe I'm missing it. So if you could speak to that within the context of the Equal Rights Amendment and everything.
So the Women's Strike for Equality, which is the strike that you're referring to that happened on August 26th, 1970, which was the 50th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. And really the point of that strike was to draw political attention to how necessary women are for the functioning of American society and to really pressure politicians to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. Like it was like, you can't live without us, even for a day. So we want to be equal constitutionally. And it actually worked. Within 2 years, Congress passed the ERA. President Nixon at the time signed it because I guess that wasn't like communism for him, so it was okay. And it goes to the states to ratify, and then the ratification fight just gets messy and huge, and Congress had given us a deadline, which was this very arbitrary deadline, which isn't, and this is really important because the deadline was not written into the text of the amendment. It was just imposed by Congress. And Congress had initially given them a deadline of 7 years. After 7 years, we were still 3 states short. They asked Congress for an extension. Congress gave the extension and gave them 2 more years. So they gave them till 1981. They still couldn't get any more states to ratify, and the amendment dies. It gets reproposed to Congress every year since then, and it never passes, gets out of committee again. Which brings us to today, where in the last 4 years, 3 more states have decided to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. So it started with Utah, actually. It was Utah, Illinois, and then last year, Virginia. And so now, technically, we have the number of states that we need to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment, but the deadline passed in like 1981 or 82. So, but since now constitutional scholars, which I am not a constitutional scholar, so bear with me, I guess, argue that since Congress self-imposed the deadline and changed it once before, they could change it again. And that we're just one act of Congress away from a ratified Equal Rights Amendment. Other people argue that since the deadline passed, we actually have to start all over and restart the process and go to each individual, like pass it Congress, pass it the president, and then go to each individual state to ratify. So we're in a bit of a gray area. Like, this has never happened before. We've never had a deadline like this. We've never missed it. Our Congress is a huge mess that can't really get anything done. And so we're living in kind of ERA limbo right now. And it will be I have no idea what's going to happen next with the ERA, but it's something to watch for, because it's very possible that we are finally going to get an equal rights amendment. I would also say that, you were saying, like, we didn't really see a lot of commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment. And from my perspective, I feel like that's because a lot of people like me, who are feminists and very engaged in this sort of thing, are kind of disillusioned with the 19th Amendment because of its limited scope and the fact that commemorating something that really only applied to white women doesn't feel particularly feminist or inclusive at this point. And so if you look at, who got the right to vote in 1920, it was white women in the South and white and some Black women in the North. Asian American women can't vote, Native American women can't vote, Black women in the South can't vote because of Jim Crow laws. And so to commemorate this anniversary and say, like, oh, women got the right to vote, just feels very white feminist. Like, it feels very exclusionary, and it's really hard to celebrate an anniversary knowing how many women got left behind.
I think there has been, like, the pandemic might have squashed some of that, but I think there has been a lot of, like, as far as commemoration of the 19th Amendment, re-examination of that issue.
Yeah.
I wondered, from your perspective, as far as, like, the second wave, like, if it's been like 50 years almost since that protest, like,
yeah,
that's something we're going to be seeing, like, people re-examining that. They're definitely thinking and talking about equal rights amendment.
Yeah, I feel like if we get the ERA passed, then that would just be so huge. And I think that would really, really be something to celebrate, because that would be constitutional equality for all women, or all citizens, I guess I should say, because again, there's, like, very different, I think that the ERA and a lot of things are about, like, those laws are about addressing gender equality from a civil rights perspective as opposed to a human rights perspective. And I think that there are differences between those two ideas. I think that they're, both important, but the Equal Rights Amendment is just the textbook definition of civil rights, right? Like, this is equality granted to us by our government. And that's hugely important, and we need it. And it's frustrating that in 2021, women are still not constitutionally equal. Like, that seems sort of criminal to me. But at the same time, like, I think that there are drawbacks from looking at gender equality as something that can be granted to us by the government, as opposed to something that is inherent in being an alive person. So.
Well, I think we're just about out of time. Dr. Kvaran, I want to thank you so much. It's great to end our discussion with the Equal Rights Amendment, because we're picking up next month with Equal Means Equal, and a discussion of the Equal Rights Amendment. And National First Ladies Library, if you go to our YouTube page, we actually do have a discussion with a constitutional scholar about the history of the Equal Rights Amendment.
That's exactly what you need.
You can head over there now, watch that talk and watch the film, and round out your day with the National First Ladies Library. So I want to thank you so much, Cara. I want to thank everyone who's watching. If you didn't get to catch the whole discussion of She's Beautiful When She's Angry, or you haven't gotten to connect with the film, it is accessible on many platforms. It's
on Amazon Prime. That's how I watched it.
Amazon Prime. It's streaming on YouTube. So please check it out. And thank you so much for joining us. This was such a fun discussion. I could chat all day.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. Have a great day. Bye.